Welcome to the Quiz Fix. I'm Cyril, and joining me as always is Olivia. Each week we dig into one real story from history, science or culture, and we close every episode with a quiz to make sure it sticks. Let's get into it. If you picture the American West, you might imagine open land, a few hopeful families, and a fresh start waiting out there. But the reality behind that image was much messier. The 1862 Homestead Act tried to turn public land into private farms. And that sounds simple until you ask the obvious question. Who gets the land? Who can actually farm it? And what happens when the land itself is difficult, contested, or already claimed by someone else?
Right. The law is one of those classic American history moments where the headlines sound straightforward and even inspiring. In theory, any adult citizen, or intended citizen, could claim 160 acres of public land, live on it, improve it, and after a few years, get legal title. That's the promise. But once you get into the details, you see how hard it was to turn a federal law into an actual working farm on the ground.
And the timing matters a lot. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War. That is not a calm moment in national history. Congress had already been debating how to settle and develop the West for years. But with Southern lawmakers gone from Washington, Republicans finally had the votes to pass the bill. So the law was part practical land policy, part political project.
Exactly. Before the Homestead Act, the federal government had sold land in big blocks, often benefiting speculators and large purchasers rather than ordinary families. Reformers wanted a system that would reward actual settlement and labour instead of quick profit. The idea was that land should be available to people willing to live on it and work it, not just to people with cash or influence.
And that idea had deep roots. It connected to the long American belief in the self-sufficient farmer, the so-called yeoman ideal. If you could give people land, the thinking went, you could create independent citizens. That was a powerful argument in the 19th century. Land was not just an economic resource, it was tied to politics, social status, and ideas about democracy.
Still, the law was not a free-for-all. A person had to file a claim, pay small fees, and then meet the residency and improvement requirements. The most famous rule was that the settler had to live on the land for 5 years and make improvements, which usually meant building a dwelling and cultivating the property. After that, the land could become theirs legally.
And 160 acres sounds generous until you think about where that land was. A farm in the Midwest on decent soil is one thing. A 160-acre parcel in dry country is another. In many parts of the Great Plains, 160 acres was not enough for successful dry land farming, especially before modern irrigation and machinery.
That's a huge point. The law treated all public land as if it were equally farmable, but it wasn't. Rainfall, soil quality, distance to markets, access to timber and water all mattered. In some areas, settlers could make a good living. In others, they struggled badly. So the promise of the law often collided with environmental reality.
And there was a legal reality too. Much of this land was not empty. It was already used by native nations, whose presence the federal government routinely ignored or minimized. So when we say the Homestead Act gave out public land, we have to be careful. Much of that land was public only in the sense that the US government claimed it. Indigenous peoples did not see it that way, and understandably so.
Absolutely. This is one of the central moral and historical complications. The Homestead Act helped promote settlement, but that settlement was part of a larger process of dispossession. Military force, treaties made under pressure, and broken promises all shape the expansion of white settlement. So while homesteaders saw opportunity, native communities often experienced invasion and loss.
That tension is impossible to separate from the law itself. The federal government wasn't just handing out land in a vacuum. It was helping transform territory it wanted to control into a landscape of farms, towns, railroads, and counties. The Homestead Act was one tool in that broader strategy.
And railroads were a big part of the story. Settlers needed transportation to survive economically. They needed to get crops to market and supplies to their farms. Railroads made settlement more feasible in some places, but they also influenced land use by shaping where people wanted to settle. Often, the most valuable land was the land near transportation routes, not just any patch with 160 acres attached.
The practical work of homesteading was brutal. People had to build shelters, break sod, fence land, plant crops, and endure extreme weather. On the plains, the famous sod house became a symbol of frontier life because timber was scarce in many areas. Families cut blocks of earth and stacked them into walls. That's a lot more labor than the romantic version of homesteading suggests.
And let's not forget the isolation. For many homesteaders, especially in the early years, neighbours were far away, supplies were limited, and medical care was distant. A bad harvest could mean financial ruin. A drought could wipe out years of effort. A blizzard could kill livestock or make survival difficult for weeks.
So the law said, in effect, here's your path to ownership. But the path required money, strength, endurance, and luck. Not everyone had those things. That's why some people sold their claims, left early, or never made it to patent. Others tried to game the system by making a claim, meeting only the minimum requirements, and then cashing out somehow after securing title.
There was plenty of fraud and manipulation. Some people used straw purchasers. Some filed claims on land they never intended to farm. Some corporations found ways around the spirit of the law. And despite the law's democratic reputation, larger patterns of land accumulation still developed. So the Homestead Act opened doors, but it did not magically create equal opportunity.
One thing people often miss is that the Homestead Act was not a single moment of land distribution. It was an administrative process that depended on surveys, land offices, paperwork, and enforcement. If the land had not been surveyed properly, claims could be messy or disputed. Federal bureaucracy had to turn broad policy into specific parcels, and that took time and often caused headaches.
And the homesteaders themselves came from all kinds of backgrounds. Some were native-born Americans from the East. Some were immigrants, trying to build a life in the United States. Some were single men, and some were families. Women also played a real role, and in some cases could homestead on their own, depending on age, marital status, and legal circumstances.
That's an important correction to the old cowboy and pioneer image. Women weren't just passive helpers standing on the porch. They worked the land, managed households, kept records, cooked for crews, and in many cases were essential to surviving the whole enterprise. Homesteading was a family labor system, not just a masculine adventure.
The law also had a broader symbolic life. It became part of the mythology of opportunity in the United States. Later generations often remembered homesteading as proof that hard work could turn public land into private property and freedom into prosperity. There is some truth in that, but it's only part of the story.
Because the law did help create thousands of farms. it did allow many people to own land who otherwise could not have afforded to buy it outright. For some settlers, the Homestead Act was genuinely life-changing. They built communities, schools, churches, and local economies. So we shouldn't reduce it to failure alone.
No, and that balance matters. It was both opportunity and hardship, both democratic ideal and colonial expansion, both real mobility and real struggle. It changed the American West dramatically, and it changed the federal government's role in land policy. The United States was not just a country with land anymore. It was a country actively deciding who would get to turn that land into property.
That word, property, is worth sitting with. Homesteading turned a public resource into private ownership through labor and time. It reflected a very American belief that ownership should be earned through improvement. In theory, the land was not simply taken, it was worked into value. But that logic also helped justify the taking of land from others, especially native peoples.
And there's a long afterlife to this policy. The Homestead Act was amended, expanded, and adapted over time. Later laws extended opportunities to different groups and changed the rules. But the original 1862 Act is still the one people remember, because it sits right at the intersection of federal policy, westward expansion, and the dream of land ownership.
So if we boil it down, the Homestead Act was an ambitious attempt to solve several problems at once. The government wanted to populate the West, reward settlement, weaken the hold of land speculators, and strengthen the Union during the Civil War era. What it got was a complicated mix of success, struggle, fraud, perseverance, and dispossession.
And that's why it remains such a rich topic. It's easy to tell a simple story about brave settlers and open land. It's much more accurate to say the Act created a legal doorway, but walking through it was hard, and the land beyond that doorway was full of obstacles, inequalities, and consequences that shaped the United States for generations.
In other words, the Homestead Act promised a farm and delivered a frontier test. For some, that test led to ownership and stability. For others, it led to disappointment or loss. And for native nations, it was part of a larger and devastating transformation of their homelands.
That's the real history. Not just land, but power. Not just farms, but policy. Not just settlement, but displacement. The Homestead Act is one of those laws that looks simple in a textbook and becomes much more revealing when you follow it out onto the ground. And on that ground, every acre had a story.
And now a word from our sponsor, Fyrebox. That's Fyrebox, the easiest way to create quizzes that grow your audience. Whether you're a marketer chasing leads, a teacher building assessments, or a creator who wants more engaged subscribers, Fyrebox lets you launch a conversion-ready quiz in minutes. No code, no designers, no waiting. Try it free at fyrebox.com. Welcome back. You just heard the story. Now let's see what stuck. Coming up, a few quick questions straight from what we just covered. 4 options each. I'll give you a few seconds to think before each answer. Ready? Here we go. Question 1. In the episode, what did the 1862 Homestead Act promise to eligible settlers? A. A free 160-acre claim if they lived on and improved the land for 5 years. B. A guaranteed cash payment for moving west. C. Unlimited land ownership without any requirements. D. A railroad job and a house from the federal government. The correct answer is A. a free 160-acre claim if they lived on and improved the land for 5 years. Question 2. Why does the script say the Homestead Act passed in 1862 when it did? A. It was delayed until after the Civil War ended. B. Southern lawmakers were gone from Washington during the Civil War, giving Republicans the votes to pass it. C. The Supreme Court ordered Congress to create it. D. It was part of the Reconstruction Acts. The correct answer is B. Southern lawmakers were gone from Washington during the Civil War, giving Republicans the votes to pass it. Question 3. What major problem did the script highlight about treating all public land as if it were equally farmable? A. The land was always already covered in railroads. B. The law ignored differences in rainfall, soil quality, water access, and distance to markets. C. Settlers were not allowed to build houses. D. The federal government refused to survey any land. The correct answer is B. The law ignored differences in rainfall, soil quality, water access, and distance to markets. Question 4. According to the episode, why is the Homestead Act morally complicated? A. It only applied to city workers. B. It gave land to native nations instead of settlers. C. Much of the land was already used by native peoples, so settlement was tied to dispossession. D. It banned farming on the Great Plains. The correct answer is C. Much of the land was already used by native peoples, so settlement was tied to dispossession. Question 5. Besides families actually farming the land, what else did the episode say happened under the Homestead Act? A. The law ended all land speculation immediately. B. Many people used fraud, straw purchases, or minimal compliance to secure title or profit. C. The government stopped surveying land altogether. D. Only immigrants were allowed to make claims. The correct answer is B. Many people used fraud, straw purchasers, or minimal compliance to secure title or profit. That's a wrap on this one. Thanks for sticking with us all the way through, quiz and all. If you liked it, hit subscribe so the next episode lands automatically. I'm Cyril, this was the Quiz Fix, and we'll be back soon with another true story worth knowing.